Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today is something of an unusual program. My guest is Bernardo Kastrup. He's been interviewed on this series several times in the past, but something new has happened. Bernardo has just completed his second doctoral degree. He has one in computer engineering, software engineering. Now he has a doctoral degree in philosophy for his work on metaphysical idealism. Bernardo, of course, is the author of 6 books, including Why Materialism is Baloney and Brief Peeks Beyond, as the book will be focusing on to some extent today. It's a collection of diverse essays that show the implications of his work in many different fields. But we're going to be jumping around quite a bit in our conversation today. We'll talk about the implications of metaphysical idealism, and also how is it possible that individual consciousness, separate individual consciousnesses, get formed within this larger universal consciousness that he postulates. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Bernardo, congratulations on your second doctorate.
Thank you.
Well, you know, as I was looking at your book, Brief Peeks Beyond, which we'll be talking about, I see that you began the introduction by saying this could be your most important book, and it struck me that
I see that. Yeah.
And the same motivation, I think, for saying that this is your most important book would also, to my way of thinking, motivate you to want to get that second doctorate, because one has the impression from reading the book that it's not just a philosophical question for you, that the implications of your version of philosophical idealism reach out into the economy and even into politics, into the way we live our lives.
Yeah, when I wrote that I thought it was my most important book. It was my most important book at that time. It was just after Why Materialism is Baloney. This was book number 5. And as you said, it has a much larger scope than all the other books, because it goes into everything. Neuroscience, politics, ethics, all the subjects that at one point or another had interested me, and where the implications of idealism played a significant role. It's also a book, Jeff, that didn't, it wasn't really planned. I was writing these essays over the years. And at some point I realized that there is a unifying theme here. There is a structure behind this that sort of happened by itself, or, quote, unconsciously. And then the book was sort of already lying in front of me before I even thought about making a book out of it.
I also had a chance to review the entire video of your defense of your doctoral thesis, and I found it really fascinating that I guess it would have been your dissertation chairman at the end gave a little talk, and he said what he really admired the most about your work was that you were willing to openly admit some of the weaknesses that you saw.
For him, it was important because he doesn't like closed systems that are immune to criticism. He thinks it's naive. And I didn't even know that was his position, but apparently I scored there.
Well, so I began puzzling over, what was the weakness? And as I listened very carefully, I realized he didn't identify it in his talk. So I began thinking about what would be the biggest weakness of your model. And it dawned on me that if I were to try and identify it, it would be the idea of a larger mind or a universal consciousness that you postulate, because I think it's a justifiable conclusion based on the data of parapsychology, but that's not the route you're taking. You're basically trying to justify it through other means. So let's go into that, because somebody could argue that the idea of an independent physical world that is completely non-conscious and not embedded in consciousness in any way is which you regard as an extraneous assumption. One could apply the same criterion to the idea of universal mind.
I actually address this explicitly, this specific criticism in parts of the thesis and in the new book as well, the idea of the world. The rationale, well, I disagree with that, and the rationale would be the following. To infer that there is mentation beyond the boundaries of my personal self, extrapolate a category that you know to exist. You know that mentation exists. It's the primary datum of existence. It's what you have before you conclude anything else. It's mentation, mind, experience. So when we say that there is mind at large, or a mind out there, I'm just extrapolating it beyond the known boundaries of my personal self. It's like saying that the earth continues beyond the visible horizon. That beyond the horizon there is still more earth. So what I'm saying is that, okay, beyond the boundaries of my personal mentation, there is still more mentation, but it's not a new category. It's not an abstraction. It's more of what we already know to exist, for sure. But when you say that there is an entire material universe that is fundamentally outside and independent of experience or mentation, now you're postulating a whole new category. You're not saying that the earth continues beyond the horizon. You're saying that there is some parallel universe fundamentally independent of ours, fundamentally different from ours. We can't even conceive of it explicitly, because to conceive of something we need images, and images are already mental, already experiential, and you're saying that this thing is not even that. So it's akin to mathematical equations, pure abstraction. That's a much, much larger step than to say that the earth continues on beyond the horizon.
Okay, that makes perfect sense to me now that you've explained it.
The other weakness, I don't think that's what Mark meant, but it was discussed during the defense, is to make explicit sense of this idea of co-consciousness. Because when you talk about dissociated alters, and it's very comfortable to think about alters in a sequence in time. Like, at this moment there is one alter, later on there is another alter, and later on maybe another one. But it's much trickier to explicitly conceive of what alters are if they are concurrently conscious. Because now it's not just swapping the programming or following a different path of cognitive associations. Now they have to be conscious at the same time, which my thesis requires. And there's plenty of empirical evidence, as you know, that alters are co-conscious, can be at least co-conscious.
Now you're referring to dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. That's what you base this whole analogy on.
Correct. And there is plenty of empirical evidence in dissociative identity disorder that alters can be simultaneously conscious. They can even vie for dominance of the body. There are dreams in which multiple alters experience the dream at the same time from different points of view. So there is a lot of empirical research on this, and I rely on that. I don't rely on analytically making explicit sense of how this co-consciousness can be possible. We know that it is, but if we try to tell ourselves how exactly it works, that becomes difficult. So that's, I think, we discussed this in my defense. I discussed that with Bernard Carr, and the conclusion is that probably the best way to make sense of that is through a proper theory of time, which we don't have. Physics is all over the place regarding time today. Some say time doesn't even exist. Others say that it's the only thing that really exists. Space is an illusion. Others say that it just arises as a secondary effect of some quantum level processes. That's the loop quantum gravity, folks. So the conclusion is, yes, we can make sense of co-consciousness only at a moment when we have a good theory of time. And Bernard Carr is working on that. And the intuition there, to make it very simple, and it's not correct what I'm going to say, but it conveys the intuition. The intuition is the following. If my consciousness swaps fast enough between being me and being you, and while it's being me, it has a web of cognitive associations that are restricted to its states while being me. And while being you, that web of cognitive associations is restricted to its states while being you, then I can be you without ever knowing it. Because I can be me right now, then jump around, be you, but you will not remember being me, because you only remember the other moments in which you were you. And then it jumps back to me, and it will only remember the previous state of being me, not being you. It's like a chess game in which the same player swaps between the two sides, black and white. And every time it swaps, it forgets that it was on the other side. And then it swaps again and forgets that it was in the second side. So it has a string of cognitive associations in memory that are restricted to each particular position. So it doesn't remember being anywhere else. So if consciousness has, let's say, what Bernard Carr calls, I forgot the name he uses, species present is what he calls it. Then we can place that species present, which is the minimum amount of time that I can be cognizant of being me. We can place that in the context of a broader theory of time and make sense of it through this sort of hopping around in time, which is inaccurate because when you think about hopping around, you think about it in time already. So it's already not consistent, but it gives an intuition of how this could be solved.
Well, and I should think as a computer engineer, there are many different strategies for parallel processing and very rapid processing between different programs that computers use that might be applicable here.
That's correct. I mean, operating systems in your computer, now we have these multiprocessors, but 20 years ago, when every processor was a single processor, it didn't have multiple cores. It could only do one thing at a time, one task, or one application at a time. We still had Windows-like operating systems with multiple tasks open, multiple programs apparently running at the same time. Well, guess what? They were never running at the same time. There is a task scheduler in the operating system that switches between them one at a time. It runs a little bit here, then moves to the other, and you as the user never get to see this. You think they're all running at the same time, while in fact the processor is swapping between them, running a little bit of each application at a time, fast enough that you think it's all running concurrently.
I think one of the opponents of your dissertation raised the issue of if you use the analogy of dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, does it mean that there's a single personality which is sort of the oversoul, let us say, of the other personalities? And I was reminded of some work by the philosopher Stephen Browdy, who has looked into multiple personality disorder, and he argues that if you look carefully at it, what you come up with is the necessity for what I believe Immanuel Kant called the transcendental ego. That there is some aspect of consciousness responsible for which personality is going to be in charge at any given moment.
Some underlying director of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Technically, if you have dissociation, suppose you have a single integrated mind, a space of experience that is integrated, and then you undergo dissociation and you form an alter. Technically, you always form two alters. The alter itself and what is outside the alter. That's technically another alter as well. The difference is in scale. If we are alters of universal mind, then what remains outside all alters, all living beings, which I call mind at large in the book and in the thesis, technically it's also an alter, but it's an all-encompassing alter. It's at a totally different scale. It's at a cosmic scale. There is much more mentation in that altar than in all the others. So although technically it's also called an altar, it's probably more fair to call it mind at large and reserve the name altar for the small dissociative processes that form within that broader, wider context of mentation. And I think even in a human being, psychiatrists talk about the host personality, which sort of, uses the same idea that the host personality is just the bigger altar, in the sense that it has access to most memories, that it has most of the associations that are still left, most of the cognitive associations still left, at any rate more than the other altars, properly called altars.
Well, I know we're getting into a lot of technical areas of philosophy here, and I think it's useful, since we're doing that, to talk about what philosophy means to you. And I thought you dealt with it very eloquently in one of your chapters where you argue against the need for pragmatic applications of your idea. Yes. The push that we have to always do. If you can't do something with it, it's worthless.
Yeah, well, you can always ask this question again and again. I mean, why do I work? Well, to make money. But why do I want to make money? Well, to buy food. But why do you want to buy food? Well, because without food I can't survive. And at the end of this chain of questions, there is always the last, most important question. Yes, you need to survive. But what are you alive for? And some people just close a silly loop. They say, well, I'm alive to work. And then it becomes a sort of a self-referring, a circular justification that's not grounded in anything. I think the answer, the question we always have to ask ourselves at the end of the day, after all the applications, I want to communicate faster and better with the latest mobile phone. I want to eat the best foods because it's nice and it's pleasurable and keeps me healthy, and I want to travel. At the end of all this, the question is, why are you alive? Or why do you want to experience these things? Because if you say, it's purely for pleasure, well, one day you are dead. And then what was it all for? And that is a question of philosophy. It's not a question of applications. It's not a question of engineering. How do I build a better phone? How do I make a faster car? How do I increase my comfort as a living creature now on this planet, living a very sheltered life as we do? At the end of the day, what is all this game for? That's the question we have to ask ourselves at the end. Otherwise, life can be pleasurable, but it will be meaningless if we don't have an answer for ourselves for this ultimate question. You can be a cynic. You can say, well, no, I'm just going to try to have as much fun as I can, and I don't care about the rest. Yeah, in the time scale of the cosmos, having all the fun that you can have in the lifetime of a human being is a lot less than a blink of an eye. It's completely irrelevant. It's completely meaningless unless you can ground it by having a relationship with something that is transcendent.
Well, you seem to suggest that philosophy, therefore, is an end in itself if it helps to develop that inner relationship.
Probably. It depends on the answer you give yourself regarding what are we alive for? What is this game for? We never have a certain answer, but we can have an answer that is satisfying to ourselves. And what will be satisfying to me is different than what would be satisfying to you. To me, what you just said is correct. Yeah, I think we as self-reflective beings, in the context of a universal mind that is itself probably not self-reflective, probably is instinctive, and we being the means for it to cognize itself through self-reflection, that would entail that the meaning of it all ultimately is philosophical. It's a philosophical approach to that meaning of life through metacognition. Well, what am I adding to to this, to existence, to universal consciousness, through my self-reflective observation of me, others, and the cosmos, that it didn't have before. To me, that would be an answer that satisfies me. So philosophy would be that. But even if you arrive at a different answer, in other words, the meaning of life is not philosophy, it's something else for you, then philosophy is still the path to arrive at that answer that satisfies you. You still need philosophy to get to that. If you never ask yourself a philosophical question, and that's a cliche, you're living an unexamined life.
Well, the question comes up for me because here I'm producing these New Thinking Aloud interviews, and there's always the temptation to promise people, if you watch this, then you will X, Y, and Z. Your life will be better in this way. What can I promise how your life will be enhanced by watching these videos? And I've, over the years, mostly tended to avoid making any such promises. It's like the conversation ought to be enough all by itself without the need to promise, that you're going to be a better person in one way or another.
Of course. I mean, all this stuff, we are addicted to this idea of practical applications. We're completely obsessed with it. It's like you have to tick that box. Nothing's worth doing unless it has a practical application. So, guess what? If you look broadly enough at what's going on, all practical applications are ultimately meaningless. They are means to an end. If you don't have that end in sight, then all the means to that end will be for nothing. Yeah. Ultimately, to mean nothing.
Surely philosophical idealism offers the potential of a very meaningful universe in which we're essentially embedded. But you make a leap, and I've often puzzled over this, and that is metaphysical idealism, or let me rephrase it differently, metaphysical materialism. You suggest that metaphysical materialism somehow promotes a consumer culture, or one might say social materialism. And I wonder about the link. Can't you be a metaphysical materialist and still live a life just as meaningful and as ethical as someone who is a metaphysical idealist?
Really, if it can be the case, of course, it definitely can. I think many existentialists who are also metaphysical materialists see meaning. It's not meaning that is out there, it's meaning that they create and project onto the world. You could argue, well, would that really suffice for me? If I know, it's like I'm cheating myself, it's like I'm a magician performing tricks for myself. Can I still be entertained with this? But I do believe that they can find meaning, and they absolutely can live ethical lives. I don't think ethics or morals need to be grounded on a particular metaphysics. I think they can be very pragmatic. You can look at what patterns of behavior promote life and civilization. I mean, I'm being Nietzschean now, right? The ground of morals is what promotes life. You get into complications because, what kind of life are you talking about? Are you talking about bacteria that cause diseases and kill us? I mean, we are busy killing them all right now. Isn't that ethical? So, there's a differentiation there on what life has priority over what other life. But you can be very pragmatic about your value system and create a perfectly valid, a decent system of ethics that is totally independent of metaphysical choices. Even under metaphysical materialism, I'm absolutely convinced you can do that. I think the question of meaning is the more difficult one. If you assume that all there really is matter outside and independent of consciousness, and the universe is a kind of mechanical contraption that operates according to certain mechanical laws and chance, because at the quantum level there is this element, this non-deterministic element of chance, then, I don't know about others, I find it very difficult to find a meaning that it's comforting for other reasons, dispels the fears of the unknown after death, all of that. The greatest fear of mankind is in one fell swoop eliminated. So it's comforting. It makes you feel warm and cozy inside. But on the question of meaning, I think it's tricky for metaphysical materialism, and it definitely promotes, maybe too strong, but it is conducive to this notion that if all there is matter, then there can be no other conceivable purpose in life but to accumulate matter. Because it's all there is. Everything else is an epiphenomenon, is an illusion. It's a second order effect, so to say, that ultimately will not endure. It will disappear. So it's conducive to this notion of ethical materialism, consumerism. It doesn't enforce it. I mean, you can be a metaphysical materialist and not be an ethical materialist. Certainly you can. But at the level of a society, of a culture, this metaphysics of materialism definitely stimulates the notion that buying stuff and accumulating stuff is the only purpose of life. And idealism doesn't. Idealism brings in a whole other set of values that seem to be favored by idealism.
In fact, you seem to be arguing in Brief Peaks Beyond almost as a political radical that if we're going to change the self-destructive patterns of consumerism that have resulted in enormous global pollution, dislocation, all sorts of social trauma for people, and it looks like it's going to get worse, not better, that we really need to rethink our metaphysics, that's how we're going to change society.
Absolutely. I think, look, the question of metaphysics is never a question that you can definitively close, because you cannot ask nature and get an answer about what metaphysics is correct. You can have evidence that favors one metaphysics and not another. I argue that the evidence favors idealism, but you don't get a definitive answer like you can get in science, because science is about the study of the behavior of nature, not what nature is. So if you want to settle a question in science, you look and see how nature behaves, and then you have your answer. There's very little room for discussion after that. But when you're asking what nature essentially is it material, is it mental, is it spiritual, is it informational, you don't get a clean answer back. You have to sort of join the dots yourself based on certain values of logic, parsimony, and so on. So it's an open question, but the default answer that we assume in a culture like metaphysical materialism is the default answer today. That choice about which there is no certainty. It can be a very bad choice. It can be an incorrect choice, and probably is. But the fact that we de facto make that choice at the social or cultural level leads to all kinds of very real, practical consequences. I mean, the pillaging of the planet probably has a metaphysical underpinning in the metaphysics of materialism. Planet, there's no consciousness behind the planet. It's all materials. It's there to be plundered. The only conceivable purpose of life is to accumulate stuff. And if we ruin it for 3 generations down the road, who cares? We're not going to be alive to know it anyway. And it's not our kids. It's going to be the kids of their kids of their kids. Oh, I'm going to be dead. There's nothing here for me to care about. So let's go on with the destruction. It definitely provides a metaphysical underpinning for that. Now, if we had made a different choice, not because it's a better choice in terms of calibrating our behavior, but because it's a choice with better evidence and better logic behind it. As a bonus, we would probably also set ourselves up for better behavior, less destructive behavior, because we are not then making these assumptions of metaphysical materialism that sort of underpin the plundering.
I've been very influenced by the sociologist Pitirim Sorokin, who argued that metaphysics is the glue that holds societies together. And he would point out, for example, in the Middle Ages, there was an idealistic metaphysics that held society together, and as a result, the artwork was all religious in nature. Even the great economic projects were the building of cathedrals with their spires pointing to the notion that there's a different reality. But he would say that any metaphysical system is not large enough, and sooner or later the system will have to collapse because the human spirit is somehow larger than any given system of metaphysics. And so over the eons, they change.
Interesting. I don't know him. I haven't read him. I'll comment on what you said. In talking about the Middle Ages, those cathedral projects that they built, I mean, those were projects that would far exceed the lifetime of anyone involved in the beginning of the project. The monarch that sponsored it wouldn't be alive to see it completed. Generations of masons would work on cathedrals. And only the last one would see it completed. I mean, I can talk about one close to where I am, Cologne's Cathedral. It was started in the 13th century and finished in the 19th. It took 700 years to build it. There is a cathedral, La Sagrada Familia in Spain, in Barcelona, it's in Barcelona, that is still being built. It's been centuries and they are still building it. So for you to find meaning in doing something that you will not see complete and your kids will not see complete and your grandkids are not going to see complete, you have to have a metaphysical underpinning to motivate you that spans beyond the limited horizons of space and time that are offered to us by metaphysical materialism. So that's definitely the case. Now, when he says that the human spirit is bigger than any metaphysical system, I think I would dare to say that there may be a category error. One thing is the metaphysics as a model in the human mind. A model that tries to reflect something that is true out there, that is true beyond the human mind. That's something, we also call it a metaphysics. And the model of that thing in our minds, guess what? We also call it a metaphysics. So which one do we mean? Human spirit is certainly much bigger than any metaphysical model in the human mind, by definition, because that model is in the human mind. And the human mind does more than that model. But that model is pointing at something beyond the human mind, which is also by definition bigger than human mind because it encompasses the human mind. Metaphysics is about what things essentially are in themselves, not how they behave, what they are. And if the world, the universe, is in itself something, and I'm a part of that universe, then that something I'm pointing to with my models, by definition, encompasses me. So in that second sense, I wouldn't say that we are bigger than metaphysics. No, we are bang in the middle of it. We are inserted, surrounded by metaphysics.
In defending your dissertation, you used an interesting term. You called it, as I recall, a Markov blanket. The idea that out of universal consciousness, our individual consciousnesses are formed sort of like alter egos of a dissociative personality. Well, those individual consciousnesses have very little access to other minds. And in fact, you went so far as to say we have no access to the internal experience of another person. A parapsychologist might dispute that in terms of evidence for telepathy, but in any case, it seems to be largely true. And the Markov blanket, I guess, is a mathematical or a term from computer engineering that refers to I guess I would call it a metaphysical membrane that causes us to experience ourselves as individuals rather than everything all at once.
It's a term used in mathematics. It has a simple definition. If you have a set of states, more or less isolated, separated from its environment, and the environment is also a set of states, then the Markov blanket is a third set of states in between the first two, and through which the first two can exchange information. So a state in the external world can influence a state in the Markov blanket, which in turn influences a state inside me. So, for instance, the Markov blanket of a human being could be seen as our sense organs: skin, eyes, mucous lining of the nose, eardrums, tongue. This is our Markov blanket in the sense that we acquire information about the states of the world through the states of our sensory organs, which we then process in our brains. So our sensory organs are like a Markov blanket, and we also influence the states of the world through our skin. I mean, if I push a rock, I'm changing a state of the world after a state changed in my own mind, and that happens through the Markov blanket, through my skin. Markov blanket is has a mathematical definition. It can be applicable physically or metaphysically. It's a very generic thing. But my point is that as dissociated authors, dissociated personalities of mind at large, we are indeed insulated by our Markov blanket in a metaphysical sense. The dissociation, the dissociative boundary demarcates our Markov blanket. And I would say that the image of that, the appearance of that to our sense organs is our sense organs. It's our eyes, skin, and so forth. And because of that insulation, we are not ordinarily, I think I did use that word because I always try to be disciplined in using that word. Ordinarily, I don't have access to your thoughts or you to mine. Ordinarily. Right. In the sense of on average, or most of the times. But nothing fundamentally prevents this blanket from being porous, so to say. There's nothing fundamental that says, well, the dissociative boundary has to be perfect. It cannot be leaky. It cannot be porous. Well, I think psi phenomena would be examples of a porous dissociative boundary. You see, if we are all essentially one mind, then what has to be explained is why I'm not reading your thoughts all the time.
Right.
And that's where dissociation comes in. But that one can read somebody else's thoughts occasionally, and I tell you, my girlfriend and I, it's about, 5 to 10 times a year, we have this moment when you're like, we know what the other is thinking, and then we say that and it's verified. And sometimes you can explain it through trivial reasons, like there's an external trigger and that gets us to think about the same thing at the same time. But sometimes it's completely not explainable, other than just coincidence, which is not an explanation at all. It's an absence of explanation. So I'm personally convinced that the dissociative boundary can be leaky. But I just don't feel, how to say this. I have to choose my battles. And I don't want to fight that battle because I already have other battles to fight.
I totally understand that, from the point of view of academic politics. As your supervisor pointed out, you're already arguing that 90% of all academics misunderstand the nature of reality.
That's true. But even beyond academia, even to reach my audience, I mean, everybody who is writing has to focus on a certain message, has to choose their battles. And I already make few choices. I mean, as you see, the book you're discussing today, Brief Peaks Beyond, I'm all over the place, and I hardly choose a battle in that book. But even I, who hardly chooses a battle, sometimes I feel I need to choose it. Otherwise, it's not like I will be misunderstood, but the focus will go out of my control. The whole discussion, the whole debate about what I'm saying will shift to something else because it's more polemical, because it ruffles more feathers, rattles more cages. And then the whole discussion will be about that. Well, in fact, I'm trying to have a discussion about ontology, about metaphysics, the metaphysics of mind. And I could use Psi as an argument, but it's an argument that's dangerous because it would suck in all the focus. And I don't want to go there.
Well, for the purpose of our discussion right now, I think it's fair to say that we could regard Psi, to the extent that it exists, as just some sort of permeability to the Markov blanket, just as you point out, our sense organs are.
True, absolutely. As I mentioned before, the challenge for a objective idealist like I am, that starts from the point of view that there is just one mind, the challenge is to explain why Psi is not happening all the time. That said, and it's also a reason I usually don't try to fight that battle for Psi, is that even if Psi did not exist, I think personally, I'm convinced it does. But even if it didn't, I think idealism would still be by far the best metaphysical option, both on logical and empirical grounds. So if that's what I think, I'm going to fight on those terms. I'm not going to use Psi because I don't want people to think that my case depends on it.
The reason that I bring up the idea of the Markov blanket is because I know it was just mentioned in passing, really, in your defense of your dissertation. But I also happened to watch an interesting video that you posted on your YouTube channel of a discussion with my friend Bruce Damer. The scientist who has developed some models for the origin of life. We call it anabiosis, the idea of life originated from non-living molecules. And according to his theory, and I'm pretty sure according to other theories along the same line, the very first thing you need is a membrane in order to separate a living system from a cell, for example. But even before there were cells, you had these membranes forming with different chemicals inside, and these membranes were like little bubbles, and they began exchanging chemicals, exchanging information with other similar bubbles. And those membranes struck me as very much akin to the Markov blanket concept that you use in referring to how individual selves get formed out of this larger consciousness.
Well, this is a tricky point, so bear with me. Lots of boundaries or membranes or structures that demarcate something in the physical world, lots of them can be seen as Markov blankets, because there can be communication between internal and external states through the states of the membrane, through the states of the boundary. For instance, temperature can be passed along, pressure can be passed along. So most things that we would identify as membranes or boundaries of some sort in the physical world can be modeled as Markov blankets. Some do not necessarily need to be. So not every membrane is necessarily a Markov blanket. I would be hard-pressed to give you an example right now, but in principle, not every membrane needs to be a Markov blanket in the sense that it needs to mediate transfer of information between inside and outside. Now, a dissociative boundary, in my view, is a membrane and can be modeled as a Markov blanket. But not every Markov blanket needs to be a dissociative boundary. I don't think a soap bubble, although it has a membrane, that membrane can be modeled as a Markov blanket. I don't think it's the extrinsic appearance, the image of a dissociative boundary. I think only the skin, the boundary of a living organism is the image, the extrinsic appearance of a dissociative process in universal consciousness. Do you know what I mean? So the fact that you have those little bubbles do not necessarily mean the early stages of dissociation. It would be a category mistake to make that bridge necessarily, because not every Markov blanket is necessarily the image of a dissociative boundary. That would be my point of view.
Well, for the benefit of our viewers, I think it's useful to reiterate a very important point that you've made, and I don't know that we've highlighted it enough in our previous conversations, and that is that when we look out at the world, when I look at your image, what I am seeing, or when I look at myself, I'm looking at the external manifestation of my inner being. I think that
the extrinsic appearance of your inner life. I think why does brain activity correlate so well with inner experience? I would say that it's because brain activity is what inner experience looks like from across its dissociative boundary. It's the appearance of the phenomenon. It's what the phenomenon looks like. And obviously then, it correlates with the phenomenon. The image of the phenomenon will always correlate with the phenomenon it is the image of. But I don't necessarily think that soap bubbles are the extrinsic appearance of the inner life of soap bubbles, if you know what I mean. I don't think that's the image of a process of dissociation. It's not the image of life. And the danger that we run is to make this analogy. Bruce Damer, I think, is on the right track. His idea of life having emerged from colonies of proto-living structures. I think it's right on. And the reason why I think he's right on is that one of the key problems in explaining abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-life, is that unless that proto-structure meets all the criteria necessary to reproduce itself, suppose that it's extreme complexity that is required for reproduction. That all has to happen by chance until the end, and then it reproduces. Now, if it stops just before the end, then you lose it all. You lose the state. You lose the accumulation of chance events that brought you almost to where you needed to be. And what Bruce's idea does is it gives you a way to preserve that state, even if some members of that community don't make it to the end. And I think that makes it much more likely. That said, I think we have to be guarded against a mechanistic interpretation of all this. If we look at ourselves as mechanical structures, then life started mechanically. You only need the mechanical components to come together in the right structure, and then the right functionality arises. I see life as the image of a process that is prior to mechanical physics. In other words, a process of mental dissociation in the universal consciousness. From that perspective, we have to be alert that, if people agree with me, then the origin of life is not an accumulation of chance mechanical happenings. The structure we see as a viable living organism is the extrinsic appearance of a process of dissociation. It's a subtle difference in how you look upon things, but it's crucially important because it prevents us from confusing, for instance, simulation with the thing in itself. I can simulate life in a computer, but doesn't mean that it's alive. I could simulate life with molecules, but it doesn't mean that that thing is alive. Nobody has managed to create life from non-life in a laboratory yet, which sort of is a big hint that there is more to that than just chance mechanical encounters, if you know what I mean.
Well, of course, the process that Bruce Damer is describing took place over eons of time, so that the fact that we haven't yet done that in a laboratory may be a question that we haven't had enough examples, enough failures yet.
Well, if it is to happen by chance, then it requires eons of time. But if you already know what constitutes a living being, and we can code DNA, we can synthesize DNA, we know what a cell looks like, we have basically the blueprints, the biochemical blueprints of a simple living organism. With that, we have the answer already. We don't need to have those eons, because we already have a thing. Let's just make a copy of it. If it were purely mechanical, it should go and be alive and kicking. You know what I mean? Yeah. For nature to find out what to do, it took eons. But we're not starting from scratch. We have the blueprints of the thing now. It should be a lot simpler to build these things in the laboratory. Now, it's not really simple. It turns out that the biochemistry of life is excruciatingly complex. But that then goes again the mechanical theory, because then even 4.5 billion years, well, I think life arose on planet Earth before the first billion years, when the Earth, as soon as the Earth cooled enough to allow for life to appear, it appeared, right? Yeah. And the biochemistry of life is so incredibly complex that even we haven't understood yet after all these centuries of study. it becomes tricky to answer how it could have happened by chance so quickly after the Earth cooled. I am more of a Schopenhauerian here. Schopenhauer's position is that the inanimate universe unfolds according to certain very regular laws, which we would call the laws of physics today. But life brings into effect or is the manifestation of some higher level laws. These are not purely mechanical, microscopic level laws. There are broader organizing principles at play when life comes into the picture. I am with him. I think there are broader organizing principles here, which by definition escape our ability to model in a laboratory, because these are not principles that operate over very small distances under conditions that you can isolate, which is what laboratory experiments require. You need to isolate the conditions, have everything under control. These higher level principles are not amenable to control the experiments, because you don't know what the range of interaction is for the thing to kick in. You don't know what the preconditions are. We're not talking about atomic level laws here. We may be talking about macroscopic level laws, even organizing principles in nature that don't kick in unless you have a broad set of microscopic conditions in place.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you pointed out earlier, one of those conditions, according to Bruce Damer, is and his partner David Deamer, who also incidentally used to engage in parapsychology research with me decades ago, they believe that a colony is necessary. That it's a social process. It's not like one individual cell first became alive and is the father of all other cells. It started from a colony. I think he told me in a recent discussion, there is no Eve. There were many.
I think it's an extremely powerful idea for the reasons I mentioned before, that colony shares the states. So as it accumulates steps towards creating the mechanisms necessary for life, that accumulation is shared across the members of the colony. So if one of them doesn't make it, there isn't a loss of all the correct steps that have already been made. Another one has a chance to make the next steps without having to start from zero. I think the power of what they are saying is that it removes this horrible idea that if you don't make it until the end in one go, you lose it all. You have to start from scratch again. You never get to bank it, if you know what I mean. They found a way to bank the process before it goes all the way to the end, to preserve that state. I think that it's the most plausible idea for abiogenesis I have seen so far.
Mm-hmm. Well, many people suggest that if we understand life, we can understand consciousness, and it strikes me that this same process of abiogenesis may also be involved in this mystery that you're pointing toward, of how one universal consciousness, through a process of dissociation or unfolding, creates a multiplicity of individual consciousnesses that see themselves as separate from the one consciousness.
I think consciousness is not created. It's where we start from. Creation happens within consciousness. You don't need to create consciousness. It's that which does the creating. But when we say conscious organism, we mean more than there being consciousness. What we mean is that there is consciousness restricted to a private inner life. So it's beyond the underlying tapestry of consciousness that percolates through all nature, in my view. It becomes private. It becomes isolated or insulated from the rest, or becomes dissociated, which is the word I like to use. I think life is the image of dissociated consciousness, of private inner lives, of there being something it is to be that organism as opposed to the rest of the universe at the same time. So from that perspective, the way to create private consciousness is not created, but private consciousness is, the image of that process in my mind is life. So if people achieve abiogenesis through artificial means, which I think we will do We will get there. We will find a way to induce dissociation in universal consciousness. I see no reason why this shouldn't be, in principle, possible. The day we do
in
that,
other words, conscious robots, for example.
Then you wouldn't call it a robot because it would metabolize. It would be an organism.
Perhaps an android.
Yeah, would you call that an android? If it's a living, breathing, metabolizing organism, you would just say that it's life. But life that we created ourselves through artificial means, but it's life. I think a robot or an android would be a simulation or an emulation of life. A robot arises within consciousness because consciousness is all there is, but I don't think there is anything it is like to be the robot in and of itself. I don't think the robot has private inner life. I think the consciousness behind the robot is the consciousness behind the entire inanimate universe as a whole. And the robot is just a few pixels of that huge image that we call the inanimate universe. There is something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole, but there is nothing it's like to be a robot or an android in and of itself. But I do think there would be something it is like to be an artificially created metabolizing organism.
And you think we will eventually get there?
So I see no reason why we couldn't get there. I also see no reason why we couldn't create intelligent robots, androids, that may be even hard to distinguish from a truly living being, but there would be nothing it's like to be them. I don't think we would need to extend our ethics to those androids any more than we need to extend our ethics to our vacuum cleaners. I don't think they should have any human rights or anything. They wouldn't be alive. They would be mechanisms, intelligent mechanisms, but not conscious in and of themselves. But artificially created living beings, there you go. Those are living beings, artificially created or not. There is something it is like to be them. They will feel pain or discomfort or stress, and now we have to extend our human rights or the rights of living beings to them as well.
You've raised so many complex issues. We'll have to have another conversation to begin to explore the possibilities. Just in the last 2 minutes. But it does seem to me that the idea of a membrane, or what we've been calling the Markov blanket, is somehow essential before we can have an individual private consciousness.
Living beings are dissociated alters. By definition, these alters have to have a dissociative boundary, and then there should be something this dissociative boundary looks like from a second-person perspective, from across the dissociative boundary. And I think that something is our sense of our skin, or the Markov blankets that surround living beings. Curiously enough, Schopenhauer 201 years ago, he already hit upon this in the way he defines life and differentiates life from inanimate objects. He says, inanimate objects are defined by the material that constitutes them. Like a rock is defined by the particular material that constitutes the rock. Living beings are defined by their function, even when the material that constitutes them keeps on changing through secretion, feeding. Atoms go in and out of our bodies all the time. We are not defined by the specific materials that constitute us. We are defined by the function, the structure. And then he says, and all living beings have some kind of membrane that separates them and their will. Schopenhauer talks about the will. It's his word for consciousness. For good reasons, he uses the word will. Separates their individual will from the broader will of the world at large. I mean, the guy 201 years ago, he already pinned down what we today are talking about, in this sophisticated language of Markov blankets and whatnot.
Well, Bernardo, once again, this has been both a delightful discussion, and I know we've left an enormous number of loose threads hanging, but I want to congratulate you on achieving a second doctoral degree, and also what I really liked about this book, Brief Peeks Beyond, is that the way you do reach out into dozens of different areas that we haven't touched upon in this discussion, that your thinking about metaphysical idealism has enormous implications for science, for culture, for society, I think for even language.
Absolutely.
So, thank you once again for being with me, and I look forward to future conversations.
Just very fast. It was a big pleasure again, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.